She refused to sit and cried until one teacher learned the terrible truth. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments from where you're watching this video. The town of Bloomsville, Georgia, was the sort of place that appeared on postcards. Wide streets lined with aged oaks, white picket fences wrapped around neat lawns, and people who waved from their porches as you passed. On paper, it was everything Margaret Raines needed after a difficult divorce and a burned-out teaching career in Chicago. Quiet, affordable, respectable, a fresh start. She had imagined unpacking boxes into her new one-bedroom cottage with a sense of peace, breathing in warm southern air free of sirens and concrete. She hadn't imagined, though, that behind every smile in Bloomsville lay something brittle. It was her first Monday at Bloomsville Elementary. A red brick building with a circular driveway, blooming azaleas near the flagpole, and children in uniforms of navy and khaki. Margaret, or Miss Raines, as she'd been introduced, walked into her new first-grade classroom 15 minutes early. The walls were pastel green, the alphabet ran in a neat border above the whiteboard, and each tiny desk had a laminated name tag waiting for its occupant. She took a deep breath, adjusted the collar of her blouse, and opened her folder. The class roster listed 18 students. One name had been added by hand, in a different ink, Aaliyah B., new placement. She didn't think much of it at the time. The morning bell rang. Children poured into the school like a low tide, the hallway echoing with high-pitched voices and clattering shoes. One by one, the students filtered into her room. A blond boy named Jackson proudly showed her a rock he'd painted. A girl with a missing tooth hugged her despite never meeting her before. Typical 6-year-old energy, innocent and chaotic. She greeted each child by name, directing them to their desks. Some were shy, some were loud. All were typical until the last one. She didn't enter with the others. She slipped in like a shadow, alone, unnoticed by the rest. Aaliyah was a small girl with skin the color of walnut wood, her hair braided in thin rows that framed a round, quiet face. Her uniform hung loose, the collar of her white shirt frayed at the edges. She stood for a moment just inside the door, eyes lowered, as if waiting to be told to leave. Margaret crossed the room gently. "Hi, Aaliyah," she said with a smile. "I'm Miss Raines. Your desk is right here, sweetheart." The girl nodded but didn't move. Her eyes flicked toward the back row of desks. Margaret motioned again and stepped aside. Aaliyah walked slowly to her desk, but remained standing beside it. Other children took their seats, opened picture books, fidgeted with crayons. Aaliyah did nothing. She just stood. Margaret thought perhaps she was nervous, or perhaps she hadn't understood. But when she gently prompted her again, "You can go ahead and sit down now, Aaliyah," the girl replied without looking up. "I prefer standing." It wasn't defiance, it wasn't even shyness. It was something else entirely. Something in the mechanical, practiced tone, in the way Aaliyah's small fingers gripped the hem of her skirt, told Margaret that this was not a preference. It was a rule. She let it go for the moment. Throughout the morning, Margaret observed quietly. Aaliyah didn't speak unless spoken to. She completed her coloring page with neat, deliberate strokes, standing the entire time. She avoided the other children's eyes. When another student bumped into her on the way to the carpet for story time, she flinched, recoiled like a bird from a stone. Margaret noted it all. At recess, Aaliyah stood at the edge of the playground beneath a dogwood tree while the others ran and climbed and giggled. She didn't move. She didn't even seem to be watching the fun, just staring somewhere between the swing set and the sky. Margaret walked over, crouched to her level and asked if she wanted to join the others. The girl whispered, "No, thank you," with a voice so small it was nearly swallowed by the breeze. That afternoon, when the final bell rang and children scattered toward buses and car rides, Margaret tidied the classroom. As she erased the board, she heard the faintest sound, a shuffle of paper, the zip of a backpack. She turned and found Aaliyah still there, standing by her desk, frozen like a statue. Her eyes were wide. "Did your ride forget you?" Margaret asked. "No," Aaliyah murmured. "He just doesn't like waiting." "Is it your dad?" "My uncle." There was something in her voice that made Margaret's stomach twist. Before she could say anything more, a loud honk blared from the front parking lot. Aaliyah jumped and bolted, her small legs carrying her out the door like prey sensing a predator. Margaret watched through the window as the girl climbed into a black SUV. The man behind the wheel did not get out. He pulled away quickly, tires grinding over gravel. At the staff meeting the next day, Margaret mentioned the new student to her grade-level team. "She's very quiet, withdrawn, and she won't sit at all, even during lunch." Mrs. Tillman, a third-grade teacher with 30 years at Bloomsville Elementary, raised an eyebrow. "Ah, that one? She's in the Faulkner's care. Old money. Don't worry, Margaret. She's got more structure now than she ever had before." "She's 6, Margaret said carefully, "and I don't think she's okay." Tillman gave her a tight smile. "You're new here. You'll learn that some of these kids need firm hands, especially the ones who come from backgrounds." No one said the word, but Margaret heard it in the silence that followed. Black. That night, in her small kitchen, lit by a single bulb, Margaret pulled out a notebook from her bag and wrote across the top, "Aaliyah B." Underneath she wrote, "Day 1. Refused to sit, flinches at contact, no eye contact, shows signs of fear." She stared at the page for a long time before closing the book. On Wednesday, Aaliyah arrived in the same faded uniform. Her backpack had a broken zipper. When she walked into class, she went straight to her desk and stood. No hesitation, no variance. When Margaret handed out storybooks, she offered a special cushion chair. Aaliyah recoiled. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm not allowed." The children began to notice. By the end of the week, a boy asked loudly, "Why doesn't she sit?" Margaret changed the subject quickly, but the moment gnawed at her. Aaliyah was becoming a target for attention, and not the kind a child needed. Margaret decided to speak with the school nurse. Nurse Jen Gladwell had kind eyes and wore her hair in a gray bun. When Margaret asked if Aaliyah had ever been in for checkups, she hesitated. "She came in once," she admitted, "for a scraped knee. I noticed bruising on her thighs, but when I asked, she said she fell. I noted it. That's all I can do unless she says more." "Could you take another look?" Margaret asked. I have a bad feeling." "I can try," Nurse Gladwell said softly. "But you should be careful. The Faulkners are not people you want to cross." The name had come up now more than once. Margaret started asking around. Edward and Grace Faulkner were the pillars of Bloomsville. He owned half the real estate in town. She chaired the Historical Society and ran charity drives every spring. They had no biological children, but were known for saving children in need. Black children, always black children. On Friday, when the children colored turkeys for Thanksgiving, Margaret watched Aaliyah draw quietly in the corner. She used brown and black for everything. No feathers, no smiles, just a dark shape with a hollow center. When Margaret knelt beside her and asked what it was, the girl whispered, "A stool for bad kids." That night, Margaret added more to her notebook. She didn't know what she was building, but she knew she had to keep building it. Every note, every whisper, every tremble. She didn't know yet how deep the rot went, but she was starting to smell the decay under Bloomsville's perfect surface. And Aaliyah, the girl who wouldn't sit, had become the quiet alarm sounding in her soul. The weekend passed in restless sleep and too much coffee. On Monday, as the children filed in again, Aaliyah was last as always, still standing, still silent. But when her eyes met Margaret's, there was something else there, something small and fragile, the beginning of trust, a crack in the wall. And Margaret knew, whatever the cost, she had to find out what lay behind it. By the second week of school, Margaret Raines had a ritual. Each morning she arrived early, 20 minutes before the buses rolled in, and sat alone at her desk with a cup of black coffee and her notebook. The rest of the faculty filtered in gradually, exchanging pleasantries and talking about weekend ball games, recipe swaps, or which students were already showing promise. Margaret, still new enough to be tolerated but not trusted, listened quietly, pen in hand, watching through her classroom window as the children trickled in. Every day, Aaliyah arrived the same way, silent, alone, standing. Margaret had tried soft encouragement, then gentle redirection. She had offered a small cushion with purple flowers on it, then tried letting her pick her own seat. Nothing worked. The girl would not sit. No matter what time of day, no matter the subject, no matter how exhausted she appeared, Aaliyah stood at her desk like a child held upright by invisible ropes. It had gone beyond habit. It was doctrine. Margaret's notebook was filling fast. Observations from each day layered over one another like sediment in a cliff wall. On day 6, Aaliyah had flinched when Margaret reached out to steady a stack of books near her desk. On day 8, she'd worn the same threadbare skirt for the 3rd day in a row. On day 10, she refused lunch again, claiming she wasn't hungry, though her stomach growled so loud the boy next to her laughed. On day 11, Margaret called Nurse Gladwell again. "She's losing weight," she said quietly. "There's something wrong. She won't eat, she won't sit, she won't speak unless prompted. And her eyes, Jen, it's like looking into a locked room." The nurse agreed to check on Aaliyah again, but when she returned from the brief exam, her expression was cautious. "She's covered in long sleeves and tights. She said she was cold. I couldn't make her take them off. I asked, but she just shook her head and looked at the door." "Did she say anything?" "Only that she didn't want to be late getting picked up, that her uncle gets mad when she's not waiting on time." Margaret thanked her and went back to class with the same heavy feeling in her chest she'd had since day 1. That evening, she stared at her kitchen ceiling for hours, replaying everything she'd seen and heard. She thought about reporting her concerns formally to the administration or calling Child Protective Services directly. But in a town like Bloomsville, she knew better than to act without preparation. The next morning, she took the first real step. During her planning period, she climbed the stairs to the main office and asked to speak with Principal Daniels. He was a square-shouldered man with a stern but affable presence, gray-haired and fond of phrases like "in my day." His office was decorated with football memorabilia and a faded photo of his high school class from 1978. He greeted her politely and gestured for her to sit. "What can I help you with, Miss Raines?" She explained her concerns. She kept her voice calm, measured, careful not to sound accusatory. She outlined Aaliyah's behaviors, her refusal to sit, the bruising, the weight loss, the avoidance of food and touch. She emphasized her experience, more than a decade teaching inner-city children, and her belief that Aaliyah's behavior was not typical trauma adjustment. Principal Daniels listened, nodded at appropriate intervals, and finally leaned back in his chair with a long sigh. "I appreciate your concern," he said. "I really do. But you're new here. You may not understand how delicate these things can be." "She's 6, Margaret said softly. He nodded again. "Exactly. And 6-year-olds can be dramatic, especially ones from hard situations. You probably don't know, but Aaliyah came to the Faulkners after losing both her parents in a house fire. Tragic stuff. The Faulkners have been incredibly generous to take her in." Margaret blinked. "You know them personally?" He smiled. "Everyone does. Grace Faulkner leads the district's education foundation. Her husband built the Annex Gymnasium. Good people. Old money. Real heart for the community." "That may be," she said slowly. "But the girl is not okay." "I understand. But unless there's something more concrete, there's not much we can do. You said it yourself. No child has seen her be hurt. No one's reported abuse. Kids say strange things sometimes. They act out, especially after trauma." Margaret stood carefully. "I understand the constraints, but I'm not comfortable pretending everything's fine." "I'll make a note of your concerns," he said, reaching for a yellow sticky pad. "We'll keep an eye out." Margaret left the office with her fists clenched in her coat pockets. That evening, she decided she needed help from someone who wasn't part of the school system. She remembered the man she'd met briefly at a community potluck a week earlier, a local journalist named Darius Brooks. He ran a small blog called Black Threads, where he reported on race issues and community politics in the region. She'd remembered him because of the way people avoided him when he entered the room. It took her 2 emails and 1 phone call before he agreed to meet. They sat in a quiet corner booth at Joe's Diner on Wednesday night, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching the rain slide down the windows. "I'm not surprised," Darius said after she told him everything. "This town's got a long history of dressing up abuse in charity clothes, especially when it comes to black kids in white houses." Margaret frowned. "You think the Faulkners are hurting her?" "I think you're the first one who's looked closely enough to see it. They've had 4 other foster kids over the last 10 years, all black, all under the age of 10. None of them stayed more than a year. 2 of them disappeared off the school rolls without warning. No records of transfers. I've tried digging, hit walls every time." "That's not coincidence," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's cover-up. They've got ties to half the institutions in this county. Police, courts, church boards. You make noise, they close ranks." Margaret sat back. "So what do we do?" "We gather evidence, real evidence, paper trails, patterns, anything that makes it impossible for them to say it's just a misunderstanding. And we protect that girl." When she returned home that night, she added more to her notebook. But she also started a second one, hidden in a locked drawer, with notes from her meeting with Darius. She knew now that this wasn't just about Aaliyah's strange behavior or a single abusive home. It was about a system designed to look the other way. The next day, Aaliyah drew a picture during art time. Margaret stopped beside her desk to admire it. The drawing was simple, crude shapes and smudged crayon, but unmistakable. A wooden stool with jagged edges, red dots at the base, a small stick figure standing beside it with arms at her sides and a dark scribble above her head. Margaret gently asked, "What's this, sweetheart?" Aaliyah didn't look up. "It's the bad chair," she said, "where I sit if I don't listen." "Where is it?" Margaret asked. "In the basement," Aaliyah whispered. Margaret felt the air thicken around her. That night, she made her first official report to the Georgia Department of Child and Family Services. She gave her name. She gave her school. She gave every observation she'd recorded and included photographs of Aaliyah's drawings. When they asked for evidence of physical abuse, she admitted she had none. Yet. The woman on the phone told her the case would be reviewed. The next morning, Margaret found a note in her mailbox from the principal. Please refrain from involving external agencies without prior discussion. This undermines trust within the school and community. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. That Friday, Aaliyah refused her lunch again. When Margaret tried to coax her to the table, the girl whispered, "He'll know if I eat here. He always knows." And then, for the first time, Aaliyah looked her in the eye. That night, Margaret sat on her couch with her notebook, her eyes burning. She knew now what she hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't just suspicion, it was knowledge. And if something didn't change soon, if no one intervened, Aaliyah would disappear like the others. Silently. Completely. In her next entry, she didn't just write observations, she wrote a promise. I will not let her vanish. I will not let this be buried. The shadows behind the Faulkners' manicured lawns were growing darker, but Margaret Raines had decided she would not look away. By the third week of September, Margaret's classroom had settled into a rhythm. The children came in with predictable moods, grumpy on Mondays, giggly by Wednesdays, restless on Fridays. But Aaliyah remained unchanged. While the others joked and passed notes, she stood. While they shifted in chairs and leaned on desks, she kept her back straight. Her arms close to her sides, her eyes always down. Each day she entered last, and each day she left the moment that black SUV pulled into the parking lot, never running, never smiling, just leaving like she had somewhere else to disappear. Margaret had documented it all. Her notebook had grown thick with dates, times, drawings, quotes, and now a second folder of reports she had started collecting with Darius. They had created a spreadsheet of names. Foster children once placed with the Faulkners, dates they appeared in district records, and dates they vanished. It was a pattern so obvious it felt absurd no one else had seen it. But of course they had seen it. They had simply chosen not to. Her formal report to Child Services had yielded a polite phone call from a caseworker named Laura Bell, who claimed she had visited the home and found nothing amiss. The child seemed nervous, she said, but given her history, that's expected. The Faulkners were cooperative. The house is immaculate. She has her own room, plenty of toys, books, structure. You can rest assured she's in a good environment. Margaret had pressed. Did you speak to Aaliyah alone? Did you ask her why she doesn't sit? Did you check for injuries? We follow standard protocol, came the reply. She told me about a punishment chair. There was a pause on the line. Sometimes children interpret discipline differently. We don't intervene unless there's imminent risk. That phrase, imminent risk, echoed in Margaret's head for days afterward. What did it mean to those in charge? A bruise? A broken bone? A body? Was the threshold for action a grave? At school, the consequences of her growing insistence were subtle but undeniable. The faculty lounge grew quiet when she entered. Requests she'd submitted for art supplies and new books were ignored. 2 parents requested to move their children out of her class. The principal reminded her to focus on instruction, not distractions. But she didn't stop watching. It was during a rainy Thursday afternoon when Aaliyah finally showed her something that Margaret could not ignore. They were doing a group drawing project. Large sheets of paper laid out on the carpet with crayons and colored pencils scattered like confetti. The assignment was simple. Draw your family, your home, your favorite place. The children huddled together in twos and threes, giggling and scribbling. Aaliyah sat apart, no, not sat, stood, working alone at her desk, the only one upright among a sea of cross-legged figures. Margaret approached slowly, kneeling beside her. Aaliyah had drawn a house, but it was split in two. The top half showed beds, a window with bars, a small girl standing next to a woman with no mouth. The bottom half was darker, crude rectangles resembling boxes, no windows, and tiny stick figures crammed together beneath the floor. "Can you tell me about this?" Margaret asked gently. Aaliyah hesitated. Then, in a whisper, she said, "Upstairs is for the good girls, the ones who smile. Downstairs is for the bad ones, the ones who cry." Margaret's chest tightened. "Are there other children in your house?" The girl nodded once. "3 downstairs. They don't go to school." She looked up then, truly looked at Margaret, and her voice dropped to something barely audible. "If they talk, they get the spoon." "What spoon?" "The hot one." Margaret kept her expression neutral, though her stomach roiled. "Who tells them that? Uncle Ed or the Friday men?" Margaret froze. "Who are the Friday men?" Aaliyah looked away and said nothing more, but she took her drawing and slipped it into Margaret's hand before walking away. That night, Margaret scanned the picture and sent it to Darius. His reply came within minutes. "This is big. We need more." "You said," she mentioned, "a basement." They decided it was time to visit the Faulkners' neighborhood. They didn't trespass, just parked on the corner and observed. The house stood at the edge of the town, a white-columned plantation-style estate behind an ornate iron gate. Security cameras were visible at the corners. A small sign read, "Private Property." Children were never seen outside, no toys in the yard, no bikes, no sidewalk chalk. Only trimmed hedges, perfect lawn stripes, and a stillness that felt forced. Every Friday night, 3 or 4 vehicles arrived, late-model SUVs, tinted windows, out-of-state plates. Men in expensive jackets, women in heels. They stayed 2 or 3 hours and left just as quietly. Darius photographed the plates. One of them belonged to Judge Timothy Cole, the same man who had denied a child abuse case in the county 3 months earlier. "We're sitting on a powder keg," he said. "And a child's inside," Margaret whispered. On Monday, she found Aaliyah in the reading corner after dismissal, her arms wrapped tightly around her backpack. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot. She was rocking slightly, back and forth. "Is everything okay, Aaliyah?" Margaret asked, kneeling beside her. The girl shook her head. "He says I smile too much at you, that I'm forgetting the rules." Margaret's voice shook. "What rules?" "I'm not allowed to like teachers. They ask too many questions." Margaret wanted to scoop the girl into her arms and run, but she didn't. Instead, she said, "You're safe here, I promise." Aaliyah didn't answer, but she stayed close until the SUV arrived. Margaret watched her walk out to the car, slow and careful, shoulders hunched as if she were already preparing for pain. That night, Margaret called Child Services again. She begged, she pleaded. She described the drawing, the other children, the hot spoon, the secret basement. They promised to review it. 2 days later, she received a letter at her classroom mailbox. District stationery, unsigned. "Your continued overreach regarding student Aaliyah B. has been noted. Further actions taken without administrative consent will result in disciplinary review." The warning was clear. That Friday, Margaret saw something that finally broke her. During PE class, Aaliyah tripped during a relay game and stumbled to the ground. When Margaret rushed over, the girl immediately pushed herself up, whispering, I'm okay. I didn't fall. Please don't tell him." Margaret helped her to the nurse's office anyway. When Nurse Gladwell gently lifted the back of Aaliyah's shirt to check for bruises, both women gasped. Long welts ran down her back, some faded, others fresh and raw. Small circular burns dotted her lower spine. "Oh my God," the nurse whispered. "These are not accidental." Aaliyah stared at the wall, her body rigid. "Sweetheart," Margaret said softly, "how did you get these?" The girl swallowed hard. The stool was too cold, so he heated it. Margaret stood and left the room without another word. She pulled her cell phone from her bag and dialed 911. That evening, uniformed officers came to the school. They questioned Margaret. They examined the drawings. They spoke with the nurse. Then they said they had to follow protocol and filed a report. By Monday, Aaliyah was still being dropped off in the same black SUV. Margaret was called into the superintendent's office that afternoon. A committee of 3 administrators waited for her. They told her the Faulkners were long-standing supporters of the district, that her accusations were unfounded and inflammatory, that she had breached the chain of command. They placed her on administrative leave pending review. As she walked out of the office, stunned and shaken, she saw Aaliyah standing by the water fountain, watching her. When their eyes met, the girl mouthed one word: "Sorry." Margaret didn't cry until she was home, but that night she and Darius met again. They copied every report, every drawing, every note. They organized everything into folders, backups, drives. They began to make calls to the press, and Margaret made herself one final promise. If the system wouldn't save Aaliyah, she would, even if it cost her everything. The following week opened with a cold drizzle and a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed in the early hours of Monday morning, the letter of administrative leave crumpled on her nightstand, unread since the day she received it. She hadn't returned to her classroom, and she wasn't sure she ever would. Her role had shifted. She was no longer a teacher in Bloomsville's eyes. She was an agitator, a problem. The woman who couldn't stop asking why a little black girl refused to sit down. The school, for its part, moved quickly. A substitute was assigned. The children were reassured. The narrative spun itself cleanly. Miss Raines was overwhelmed. She had taken a leave of absence. There was no cause for concern, and Aaliyah, silent and watchful as ever, was placed back into routine. Or so it seemed on the surface, but Margaret wasn't idle. She and Darius met every night that week. His apartment, cluttered with folders, camera equipment, and a broken printer he hadn't yet fixed, had become their makeshift command center. On his wall, he'd pinned photos of the Faulkners' house, a map of the county, and a list of license plates from every visitor who entered the estate on Fridays. They connected the names to public records: judges, business owners, politicians, some from Bloomsville, others from neighboring towns, a few from out of state. The pattern was clear. Power protected power. Still, patterns weren't enough. They needed evidence no one could ignore. They needed something undeniable. "I think we need to get inside," Darius said one night, his eyes bleary from hours of scrolling through zoning records. "We can't wait for the system to act. They're protecting each other." Margaret didn't hesitate. "How?" "The basement," he replied. "That's where the kids are. That's where they hide what they don't want seen. It's too dangerous. We can't just break in." "Then we do the next best thing," Darius said. "We get someone to describe what's inside." A plan began to form, one that required them to tread carefully, invisibly, and above all, legally. They needed more from Aaliyah. But with Margaret banned from campus and under threat of further action if she made contact, they needed help. That help came unexpectedly from Nurse Jen Gladwell. Late Thursday afternoon, Margaret's phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered anyway. "Miss Raines," came the hushed voice, "this is Jen Gladwell. I can't say much, but Aaliyah asked about you today. She asked why you were gone. She looked scared." Margaret swallowed hard. "Can you get her a message?" "I can try. They watch everything now, but if it's simple, tell her I believe her. Tell her I'm not giving up." "I will." The line went dead. 2 days later, another call came. This time it was Darius. She reached out. Margaret sat upright on her couch. "What? Who?" "Nurse Gladwell. She said Aaliyah gave her something, a drawing. I'm picking it up now." The drawing, when Margaret finally saw it, was simple but unmistakable. A boxy house. Inside, different rooms, one labeled mine with a single stick figure. Another labeled downstairs with 3 smaller figures. A hallway, a dark space, and in the corner, written in shaky but clear print, one sentence. "The new girl came Tuesday. She cries a lot. He says she will learn." Margaret stared at it for a long time, her throat tight. "That's it," Darius said softly. "This is what we needed. There are more kids. It's not just Aaliyah, and they're still bringing them in." They immediately began documenting. The drawing was scanned, backed up, time-stamped. Darius reached out to a contact he had at a newspaper in Atlanta, a young reporter hungry for the kind of story that would break headlines. Meanwhile, Margaret turned her focus to the basement. The town's property records showed a renovation permit filed 3 years ago for the Faulkners' home. It claimed the addition of a personal wellness space, but there was no record of inspection, no photos, no details. When they traced the permit to its signatory, they found it was authorized by Walter Bell, Grace Faulkner's cousin. Everything was sewn together: blood, power, silence. That Friday, they returned to their surveillance spot. Parked a block down, wrapped in darkness, they watched as the familiar SUVs rolled in. 3 men, 1 woman, all dressed like they were going to a fundraiser. They entered at 7:42 p.m. and left at 9:16. Darius filmed everything. "We need audio," he said, "video, something from inside." "I can get us closer," Margaret whispered. "Aaliyah's school ID has their address on the emergency form. I still have it." He looked at her. "We'll go next week, just to see, just to listen." But fate moved faster. The following Monday, Nurse Gladwell called again. This time her voice was urgent. "She collapsed in class," she said. "Blood sugar crash. She hasn't eaten in days. When I checked her again, Margaret, the marks are worse. They're healing over other bruises, and there's something else." Margaret drove to the school, not caring about the restraining order or her suspension. She arrived as an ambulance pulled away, its lights off, its siren silent. But through the back window she saw Aaliyah, pale and limp, an oxygen mask over her face. She walked straight into the nurse's office. Jen was there, holding a clipboard. Her eyes were red. "She has burns, Margaret, on her shoulders, small, round, like someone pressed a hot spoon to her skin. And she begged me not to tell. She said if I did, they'd make her sit on it again." Margaret felt rage rise in her like a wave. Where is she now? Willow Creek General, under observation. That night, Margaret and Darius didn't sleep. They sat in the hospital waiting room with cups of bad coffee, watching as police came and went, offering nothing. At 2:12 a.m., a young resident stepped out and told them she would survive. Malnourished, dehydrated, burned, but she would live. "I'm filing a report," the resident said. "Whatever is going on at that house, it's not just neglect, it's torture." The next morning, Darius's video and Margaret's documentation went live on Black Threads. Within hours, the post was shared over 10,000 times. By nightfall, the Atlanta Reporter had published a full exposé, but the town didn't rejoice. It recoiled. Margaret received threatening phone calls. Her tires were slashed. She was served a formal notice of termination. Darius's blog was taken down due to community complaints. Still, they pressed on. And then, 3 days later, Nurse Gladwell handed Margaret a final envelope. Inside was a new drawing. Another house. Another basement. But this time, 9 stick figures. And a new word scratched into the corner with trembling letters. Help. They had enough. Margaret turned to Darius, her hands shaken. "We go in Friday night." He didn't argue. They both knew it was the only way. The rain had returned by Friday morning, soft and cold, the kind of drizzle that seemed to seep into bone and brick alike. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of Darius's car, parked a block away from the Faulkners' estate, watching the wide white columns loom through the fog. She wore dark jeans, a black jacket, and sneakers. No jewelry, no perfume. Her hair was tied back tightly, her face bare. She felt hollowed out, stripped of everything that made her ordinary. The woman she had been when she first arrived in Bloomsville, hopeful, reserved, maybe even naive, was gone. In her place sat someone who had memorized every creak in the floorboards of a child's pain. Someone who could not be quiet anymore. Darius sat beside her, methodical and steady. He checked his camera equipment again, reviewing battery levels, adjusting a small lapel mic, and confirming the time with a glance at his watch. He'd worn a utility jacket and a pair of old boots. His face was expressionless, but his jaw flexed with tension every few seconds. Neither of them had spoken since they left his apartment an hour ago. There was nothing left to say. They had planned the entry down to the minute. At precisely 8:03 p.m., just after the third visitor would arrive, a man who Darius had identified from a previous footage as a retired state senator. They would approach the east side of the property where the hedges were lowest. They'd studied the rotation of the motion lights and the location of the security cameras. The Faulkners had invested in surveillance, but not in subtlety. The blind spot near the garage door was just wide enough for 2 people to pass through undetected. They weren't going to steal. They weren't going to vandalize. They were going to document, to gather proof that could no longer be dismissed. Margaret clung to that distinction like a raft in storm water. If they were caught, the legality of their actions would collapse under the weight of the Faulkners' influence. But if they succeeded, if they could capture even a fragment of the horror Aaliyah had drawn, there would be no more denials. At 8:01, the last SUV pulled into the driveway. Its headlights cut through the rain as it crawled to a stop, idling for a moment before the rear passenger door opened. A man in a camel-colored coat emerged and walked up the drive without knocking. The door opened for him before he reached it. He stepped inside. Darius nodded. Now. They moved in silence, circling around the back of the property, hearts pounding. The wet grass muffled their footsteps. The shadows offered just enough cover. At the base of the east wall, where a hedgerow dipped low enough to reveal the wall-mounted power box, Darius knelt and disabled the auxiliary security light using a tool he'd borrowed from a friend in construction. The camera there would go black for 20 seconds, long enough to slip past and reach the garage entrance. They did. Margaret's breath caught in her throat when Darius pressed a slender tool into the side door lock. After 2 tense seconds and one quiet click, the door swung inward. They slipped inside. The interior of the garage smelled faintly of bleach and oil. It was immaculate. A red SUV and a black luxury sedan sat side by side. To the left was a narrow door leading into the house. They paused there, listening. Voices echoed faintly from deeper inside. Laughter, glass clinking, a man speaking in low tones. Somewhere above them, music was playing, muffled and jazzy. They moved quickly but carefully down the back hallway. The interior of the house was exactly as the community had described it. Spotless, high-end, curated. Polished hardwood floors, framed oil paintings of seascapes, tasteful flower arrangements. A wall of family photographs, all showing the Faulkners with children of varying ages and races. Children who never smiled with their eyes. At the far end of the hallway, they found it. A door painted the same cream color as the wall, almost disguised, with a keypad lock and a second deadbolt. Darius removed his phone and snapped a photo. Then he knelt. "Give me 30 seconds," he murmured. Margaret waited, her eyes flicking back toward the main hallway. The laughter had faded now. She could hear only the soft drone of a television and the occasional crack of ice against glass. Then the lock clicked. Darius opened the door slowly. A narrow stairwell descended into darkness, the air below thick and damp. Margaret turned on her flashlight, keeping the beam low. They crept down the steps. What awaited them was not a cellar or a guest suite. It was a series of rooms, 7 in total, each separated by metal-barred doors, not unlike holding cells. The walls were unfinished concrete. The floor was stained and uneven. A single bulb hung from the ceiling in the main corridor, flickering softly. And inside those rooms were children, 7 of them by Margaret's count. Some were awake. Others lay curled on mattresses no thicker than folded blankets. All were silent. All were dark-skinned. Most were barefoot. One girl, no older than 5, sat against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, eyes wide and unblinking. Margaret stepped forward and dropped to her knees. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're here to help." The girl didn't move. Darius filmed everything. The layout, the rooms, the faces, the details. He documented the wires leading into the corners of the ceilings, where small, crude cameras had been mounted. He filmed the heavy wooden chair bolted to the floor in the farthest room, its seat blackened and covered in jagged metal screws. Then the girl closest to Margaret finally spoke. "Are you the real help?" she asked in a voice too small for her age. "Because the others said they were help too, but they lied." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "We're real," she said, "I promise." Another child, a boy, pointed towards the darkest corner. "The new girl's sick. She won't wake up." Margaret hurried across the room and found her, curled in a fetal position, her skin hot and dry, her lips cracked. She couldn't have been more than 4. She was burning with fever. "We need to get her out of here," she said urgently. Darius was already dialing. He contacted a friend at the state police who had quietly offered help weeks earlier. Lieutenant Angela Ramirez, a woman with a reputation for fighting dirty politics with clean fire. When he explained what they had found, she didn't hesitate. "I'm sending a team now. ETA 25 minutes. Get the kids safe. Don't engage." They began gathering the children, coaxing them into one room with soft voices and outstretched hands. Some cried, some held hands. One boy vomited from panic, but they followed. They trusted Margaret's voice, her eyes. The way she said their names were important, even if she didn't yet know them. Then a noise froze them all. Car doors, several, loud and close. Headlights spilled across the basement's high windows. Margaret turned to Darius. "They're here." He pulled a small radio from his jacket and slipped it into her hand. "Stay down here," he said. "Keep them quiet. I'll stall them upstairs." She wanted to argue, but there was no time. He was already climbing the stairs, camera still strapped to his chest. Margaret huddled the children into the smallest room and pulled a dirty blanket across the entrance like a curtain. She knelt among them, whispering reassurances, holding tiny hands. One boy, maybe 6, leaned into her and whispered, "If we're good, do we get chairs again?" She felt the tears slide down her cheeks. "Yes," she said, "as many as you want." Above them, footsteps thudded, voices raised, shouting, then a crash, then silence. Margaret gripped the radio tightly. The next voice she heard was Darius's, strained but steady. "They're contained. Ramirez's team is here." Relief hit her so hard she nearly collapsed. Minutes later, the stairwell filled with light as uniformed officers stormed in. Badges visible, weapons holstered, voices gentle but firm. They began lifting the children one by one, wrapping them in blankets, carrying them upstairs. Margaret went last, the feverish girl in her arms. The house above was chaos. 2 men in suits were face down on the floor, hands cuffed behind their backs. Grace Faulkner was shouting at a young officer, her perfectly coiffed hair unspooling in curls, but the noise faded behind Margaret. All she could hear was the soft breath of the girl in her arms and the voices of the children asking over and over, "Is it really over?" She held them closer. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, it is." The children slept. For the first time in months, perhaps years, they slept in clean beds, wrapped in warm blankets, beneath soft lighting in a secure pediatric wing guarded by 2 state officers at all times. Margaret sat in a chair beside one of those beds, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of the little girl's chest as the IV in her arm delivered the fluids she so desperately needed. Mia, they had learned her name was. She had been reported missing from a neighboring county just over 3 weeks ago, snatched from her foster placement during a late-night transfer that no agency could account for. She had not spoken a word since arriving at the hospital. Not even when the nurses cooed at her or when the trauma psychologist tried to prompt her with puppets and drawings. She only watched, silent, unmoving, alert. Margaret brushed a strand of hair from the child's forehead and looked across the hallway where Lieutenant Ramirez stood with Darius, their expressions tight and low-voiced behind the glass. The raid had succeeded. 9 children rescued, 5 adults in custody, more names, judges, donors, state workers, emerging with each new document the police unearthed from the hidden back rooms of the Faulkners' estate. They had found everything. The files, the payment ledgers, the recordings, and worst of all, the roster. Each child had been numbered, each room assigned by code, and the roster bore the dates of arrival, behavior notes, and, most chillingly, a column marked with the word compliant. Margaret had sat in the police station for 5 hours giving her statement. She had produced every page of her notebooks, every drawing, every photo she and Darius had captured over the past month. She had recounted each moment of warning from the school, each time she'd been told to stop looking, each denial from child services. She had spoken until her voice cracked and her hands trembled. And in return, they had let her see the children. They had let her walk into that room and kneel beside Aaliyah. The girl had looked up at her, blinking slowly, her face still pale, her arms marked with faint bruises. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. Margaret broke. The news broke too. By morning, every major network was leading with the story. "Basement House of Bloomsville," one headline read. "Children rescued from alleged foster trafficking ring." Photos of the Faulkners' mansion circulated online. The sheriff gave a press conference flanked by local officials who had not raised a single alarm until it was too late. But they wore their grave faces well. They promised investigations. They spoke of learning lessons and reviewing protocol. The district superintendent issued a public statement expressing shock and horror, praising the swift action of state authorities. But they said nothing of Margaret Raines. They did not mention her name nor Darius's. Instead, a separate article ran in the Bloomsville Chronicle, an op-ed penned by school board president Richard Trask, condemning the reckless behavior of certain individuals who, despite lacking evidence, took it upon themselves to interfere in delicate legal matters, thereby jeopardizing the integrity of the case. That evening, Margaret received an official notice from the school district. Her employment was terminated effective immediately due to conduct unbecoming of an educator and violation of district protocol regarding student contact and media exposure. She sat on her porch, holding the letter, the paper going soft in her hands from the misty air. Darius sat beside her, saying nothing. "They're going to paint me as the problem," she said at last. "They already have." "Let them try," Darius replied. "We have the truth." Truth doesn't mean anything when the town's already made up its mind. But Darius wasn't convinced, and neither was Lieutenant Ramirez. 2 days later, they stood together in a press conference held by the State Attorney General's office in Atlanta. This time, Margaret's name was spoken clearly. Ramirez recounted the findings of the raid, the coordination with investigative journalism, and the courage of the former teacher who risked her career to protect the voiceless. The room was silent as photos of the basement were displayed. The chair, the beds, the children's drawings. And then Ramirez played one audio clip, an interview with a 7-year-old girl who had been locked in the basement for nearly a year. "They told us we were lucky," the girl said, "that no one else would take us, that the judge said so. They said if we were bad, we'd get the heat spoon, and if we screamed, we'd go away." Reporters cried. The air in the room became heavy. The Attorney General stepped up to the podium and announced federal charges against Grace and Edward Faulkner for child endangerment, human trafficking, and conspiracy. 4 additional arrests were pending. The state would be auditing every foster placement made in the last 5 years, and a task force was being created to investigate institutional complicity. Margaret returned to Bloomsville the following day. She had not expected a parade, but the glares cut deeper than she anticipated. Neighbors turned away. A woman in the grocery store muttered the word "homewrecker" under her breath. At the library, someone had scratched "traitor" onto her parking sign. They blamed her for what she had uncovered. She had broken the illusion. And, in small towns, illusions were sacred. She tried to ignore it. She tried to remind herself that the children were safe, that the truth was worth the price. But the loneliness grew louder. Even Darius, now traveling between counties to investigate new leads, was harder to reach. She found herself walking aimlessly some days, wandering the edges of town, avoiding places that once made her feel welcome. Then, one morning, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a child's drawing, a classroom, a circle of desks, and in the center, a smiling figure with curly brown hair labeled Miss R. At the bottom was a single sentence in careful block letters. Everyone gets to sit in your class, even me. Tears fell freely. That afternoon, she received a phone call from the governor's office. She had been recommended to serve on the newly formed Commission for Child Welfare Reform. Her role would be advisory. Her expertise in early childhood education, coupled with her first-hand experience exposing systemic abuse, made her an invaluable asset to the task ahead. She accepted. 1 week later, she testified before the state legislature. She spoke not as a martyr or hero, but as a teacher, a woman who had simply chosen to see a child when no one else would. The night after her testimony, she visited the hospital one last time. Most of the children had been placed in temporary homes. Aaliyah remained, undergoing trauma counseling, slowly beginning to eat, to sleep, to smile. Margaret sat beside her in the garden outside the pediatric wing, where the girl colored quietly in a notebook. "Do you remember the chair?" Aaliyah asked suddenly. Margaret nodded. "I don't think about it much now," she said, "but sometimes at night I feel my feet want to stand, even when I'm in bed." "That's okay," Margaret said gently. "You can sit or stand or lay down. You get to choose now." Aaliyah looked up, her eyes softer than they had ever been. "Do you have a classroom again?" "Not yet," Margaret said, "but I will." A pause. "Can I come?" Margaret smiled. "Any time you like." In the distance, thunder rolled softly over Bloomsville. But in that moment, on that bench, under the late autumn leaves, Margaret felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest again. Peace. Not because the fight was over, but because it had begun. 1 year had passed since the children were carried out of that basement in the dead of night, wrapped in emergency blankets and blinking against the unfamiliar light of freedom. The house itself had been boarded up, the gates sealed, and eventually condemned after court-ordered excavation revealed soundproofed chambers and hidden passageways that even the original blueprints hadn't acknowledged. The community of Bloomsville, once determined to defend its illusion of perfection, now lived with the bitter awareness of what had festered beneath its surface. A handful of officials had resigned. Some had been arrested. Others simply vanished into polite obscurity, never admitting wrongdoing but quietly removing themselves from the spotlight. Margaret Raines hadn't returned to the classroom, not in Bloomsville at least. The school board had offered her a settlement after the lawsuit, a tidy sum paired with an NDA she never signed. Instead, she'd taken up the governor's invitation to join the Child Welfare Reform Commission, where she helped shape new guidelines for foster placement audits, oversight committees, and cross-agency accountability. The work was exhausting and often thankless, but it was meaningful. It kept her moving forward. Still, she missed the classroom. She missed the texture of crayon wax on paper, the clatter of pencils rolling off desks, the way children laughed without knowing why. She missed their questions, their drawings, their honesty. Most of all, she missed the sacred ordinariness of a school day where no one was afraid. But this morning was different. This morning, she stood in front of Room 4B at Willow Creek Elementary, back in Bloomsville, not as a staff member, but as a guest. The new principal, Maria Rodriguez, who had once cast the sole dissenting vote against Margaret's termination, had personally invited her to speak. The school had undergone significant changes since the investigation. The board was new. The disciplinary policies had been rewritten. And the student body, too, had begun to look a little more like the community it served. Diverse, curious, cautious, but healing. Margaret smoothed her navy dress, adjusted her cardigan, and took a breath before stepping inside. 22 children sat in a semicircle on a bright rug, their eyes wide with expectation. At the front of the room, a tall woman with gentle eyes stood beside them, her name badge reading Miss Patel. She smiled warmly as Margaret entered. "Class," she said, "this is Miss Raines. She's here to talk to us today about something very important." Margaret greeted them, then lowered herself into the small chair that had been set out for her, knees awkwardly bent, feet flat on the floor. She smiled at the children. They smiled back. "Can I tell you a story?" she asked. They nodded. "It's about a girl I once met, a girl who was very quiet. She didn't like to talk much, and she didn't like to sit down, not because she was naughty or stubborn, but because sitting meant something very different to her. You see, where she came from, sitting wasn't safe. It was something that could get her hurt." The children listened, some leaning forward, others hugging their knees. "But she was very brave," Margaret continued. "She kept coming to school, she kept learning, and eventually she found people who saw her, not just with their eyes, but with their hearts. And slowly she learned that sitting could mean something else. It could mean rest. It could mean choice. It could mean safety." A hand shot up from a little boy with freckles and glasses. "What happened to her?" "She's doing really well now," Margaret said. "She's learning to smile again. She even got a sparkly purple chair for her new desk." The children giggled. Another hand. "Did she ever come back to school?" "She did," Margaret said. "In fact, she might be here today." A ripple of excitement went through the room. Just then, the door opened quietly. A girl with chestnut skin and neat braids stepped inside, holding a small notebook to her chest. She wore jeans and a hoodie with a glittering butterfly across the front. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Margaret. "Aaliyah," Margaret said softly. The girl beamed. Principal Rodriguez appeared in the doorway behind her, eyes shining. "She insisted on coming." Margaret stood, and Aaliyah crossed the room quickly, wrapping her arms around her waist. The embrace was firm, no longer tentative, no longer filled with the silence of fear. It was joy. It was connection. It was proof. The children applauded, not quite knowing why, only that something good was happening. Aaliyah turned to them. "Hi," she said. "Last year I couldn't sit down, not even on the rug, but Miss Raines helped me. And now I get to sit whenever I want." She walked to an empty spot in the circle and folded her legs beneath her. The teacher brought her a small cushion from the shelf, which she accepted with a smile. Margaret swallowed back tears. Afterward, the class presented her with a handmade thank you card, signed by every student in rainbow markers. They had drawn chairs all around the border. Tall chairs, wide chairs, even beanbags and swings. Across the top it read, "In your room, we all get to sit." When the visit ended, Margaret lingered by the classroom door, watching the children gather their things. Aaliyah stayed close, her hand in hers. "Do you think," the girl asked shyly, "you'll ever teach again?" Margaret crouched to her level. "Maybe," she said, "but only if you come and be my helper." Aaliyah grinned. "Deal." That evening, as the sun dipped low over the Georgia hills, Margaret returned to her cottage. On the coffee table sat a folder of unfinished commission reports, a stack of legislative drafts, and a letter from a nonprofit school asking if she'd consider consulting on trauma-informed education. But she walked past it all and pinned the card to her bulletin board. She didn't need accolades. She didn't need a title. What she needed, what every child needed, was what Aaliyah had finally been given: a place to sit, a place to rest, a place to belong. And now, somewhere in a second-grade classroom, a girl once silenced was telling her story in her own words. That, Margaret knew, was enough. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Watch the next video to see what happens when truth finally comes to light. And share this video. Someone out there might need to see it.